Constitution is a document consistently under attack by parties whose political motivations persuade their feelings about individual items within the contract between the people and the government. Perhaps no element has been more under assault than the Electoral College. This strange and seemingly antiquated way of selecting a president feels disconnected from the will of the people. Over and over, frustrated citizens whose candidate for president doesn't secure the votes within the system call for its abolishment. They insist that an election by direct democracy, primarily by means of the popular vote, is a much more desirable method of selecting a person for the presidency. This level of frustration has especially come to light in recent memory because of the elections of 2000 and 2016. In both instances, the losing candidate had the most votes in the popular count, but ultimately failed to prevail in the Electoral College. While this isn't unique to the American experience, it is most fresh in our memories, and one that caused the losing side a great deal of frustration and discussions around its removal as the methodology of selection. The founders created the system as a compromise during the Constitutional Convention, as a way for less populated states to have a say in who is elected president. It gives smaller, less populated states like Vermont and Wyoming a weighted voice in the overall picture of the election. While it may be misunderstood, it has much more to do with how the founders saw each individual state when the convention was convened. On the heels of a Revolutionary War and having attempted a loose confederacy between the states, the founders saw their own states as autonomous countries whose voice needed to be heard in the collective union, but who insisted upon maintaining their own individual statehoods. Some insist today that it is a remnant from the southern states who wanted to make sure that they were represented based on the holding of slaves and their lack of population, and so it should be eliminated. Others feel its abolishment is necessary because the states are far more connected as one country than they are as individual autonomous entities in our modern era. Regardless of one's opinion about it, the mechanism has a subtle brilliance that might just be the pathway out of the two-party duopoly. The fundamentals of the Electoral College are based upon the census. Every 10 years, the federal government is charged with the counting of the people in the nation, and then after the data is collected, assigning apportioned representation upon the discovered numbers. The total number of votes per state for the Electoral College are a combination of the number of House districts and the number of senators. This provision comes from Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, and describes a body of people who stand as electors outside of the system. They are secured typically by the candidate or the parties, and after the general public cast their vote for president, the electors are bound and vote at the State House for the winning candidate. Each candidate has their own set of electors that would cast an in-person vote at the House for their candidate if he or she won the state. For example, when Bill Clinton won Arkansas, his slate of electors traveled to Little Rock and cast their vote for Mr. Clinton. Had George H.W. Bush won Arkansas, his slate of electors would have then been the ones voting. After the electors vote, that is then turned into the House of Representatives and the Senate for their counting. The election is certified by the President of the Senate, the current and sitting Vice President. It sounds confusing, but it's all been described in detail in the Constitution, and it's been the process nearly unchanged since the beginning. Contrary to the media presentation and what our education system describes as our form of government, the popular vote and direct democracy have no relevance upon the selection of president. There is no provision in the Constitution in which it is described that the popular vote should be taken into account on the national level. This system was always intended to give the states a strong and unique voice in the election of the single person who presides over the executive branch of government. In fact, one of the primary arguments in the Anti-Federalist Papers that the college helped to address was a fear that the presidency would evolve into a monarchical position if it were strictly based upon popularity and the dominance of the large populations in the largest states. The majority vote is simply made up by the press in order to create the illusion of a horse race. The Electoral College was proposed near the end of the convention by the Committee on Unfinished Parts, chaired by David Brearley of New Jersey, to provide a system that would select the most qualified president and vice president. Historians have suggested a variety of reasons for the adoption of the Electoral College, including concerns about the separation of powers and the relationship between the executive and legislative branches, the balance between small and large states, slavery, and the perceived dangers of direct democracy. One supporter of the Electoral College, Alexander Hamilton, argued that while it might not be perfect, it was at least excellent. Through most of the 19th century, the Electoral College was utilized and empowered in ways unfamiliar to our modern mindset. John Quincy Adams, the sixth president of the United States, was actually the Electoral College's choice of compromise in an election that ultimately did not meet the requirements for the selection of president by the Electoral College in the Constitution. This provision that requires the majority of the electors was intended, and for much of our history utilized, as a way in which the presidency stood outside of direct democracy. That may raise frustration and ire to our current beliefs about how elections in the United States work, but the historic reality of this institution is that it has been used much for the better than it has for the harm.